While I think it is right for me to call for improvements within government, I also want to make a plea to all honourable members to be targeted and considered in their written questions that they table at this time, and to avoid swapping departments with questions on fast-moving situations, which will be superseded before they can be answered. I now call the Prime Minister, who should speak for no more than 10 minutes. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'll make a statement about the next steps in our battle against coronavirus and how we can, with the utmost caution, gradually begin to rebuild our economy and reopen our society. For the last 2 months, the British people have faced a grave threat with common sense, compassion and unflinching resolve. We have together observed the toughest restrictions on our freedoms in memory, changing our way of life on a scale unimaginable only months ago. All our efforts have been directed towards protecting our NHS and saving lives. Tragically, many families have lost loved ones before their time, and we share their grief. Yet our shared effort has averted a still worse catastrophe, one that could have overwhelmed the NHS and claimed 500,000 lives. Every day, dedicated doctors, nurses and social care workers, army medics and more have risked their own lives in the service of others. And they have helped to cut the reproduction rate from between 2.6 and 2.8 in April to between 0.5 and 0.9 today. The number of COVID patients in hospital has fallen by over a third since Easter Sunday. Our armed forces joined the NHS to build new hospitals on timetables that were telescoped from years to weeks, almost doubling the number of critical care beds and ensuring that since the end of March, at least a third have always been available. Our challenge now is to find a way forward that preserves our hard-won gains while easing the burden of the lockdown. And I will be candid with the House, this is a supremely difficult balance to strike. There could be no greater mistake than to jeopardise everything we've striven to achieve by proceeding too far and too fast. We will be driven not by hope or economic revival as an end in itself, but by data and science and public health. And so the government is today submitting to the House a plan which is conditional and dependent, as always, on the common sense and observance of the British people and on continual reassessment of the data. That picture varies across the regions and home nations of the United Kingdom, requiring a flexible response. Different parts of the UK may need to stay in full lockdown longer, but any divergence should only be short-term, because as Prime Minister of the UK, I am in no doubt that we must defeat this threat and face the challenge of recovery together. Our progress will depend on meeting 5 essential tests: protecting the NHS, reducing both the daily death toll and the infection rate in a sustained way, ensuring that testing and PPE can meet future demand, which is a global problem, but one that we must fix, and avoiding a second peak that would overwhelm the NHS. A new UK-wide joint biosecurity centre will measure our progress with a 5-stage COVID alert system, and the combined effect of our measures so far has been to prevent us from reaching level 5, a situation that would have been in which the NHS would have been overwhelmed, and to hold us at level 4. Thanks to the hard work and sacrifices of the British people, by following the social distancing rules, we're now in a position where we can move in stages to where I hope the scientific advice will tell us that we are down to level 3. But this will only happen if everyone continues to play their part, to stay alert and to follow the rules. We must also deal with the epidemic in care homes, where a tragic number of the elderly and vulnerable have been lost. And while the situation is thankfully improving, there is a vast amount more to be done. And of course, we need a world-leading system for testing and tracking and tracing victims and their contacts. So I'm delighted that Baroness Harding, the chair of NHS Improvement, has agreed to take charge of a programme that will ultimately enable us to test hundreds of thousands of people every day. All this means that we have begun our descent from the peak of the epidemic, but our journey has reached the most perilous moment where a wrong move could be disastrous. So, at this stage, we can go no further than to announce the first careful modification of our measures. Step one in moving towards COVID alert level 3, a shift in emphasis that we can begin this week. Anyone who cannot work from home should be actively encouraged to go to work, and sectors that are allowed to be open should indeed be open, but subject to social distancing. These include food production, construction, manufacturing, logistics, distribution, scientific research. And to support this, to explain this again, we're publishing guidance for businesses on how to make these workplaces safe, COVID secure. People who are able to work from home, as we've continually said, should do so. People who cannot work from home should talk to their employers about returning this week and the difficulties that they may or may not have. Anyone with COVID symptoms, obviously, or in a household where someone else has symptoms, should self-isolate. We want everyone travelling to work to be safe, so people should continue to avoid public transport wherever possible, because we must maintain social distancing, which will inevitably limit capacity. Instead, people should drive, or better still, walk or cycle. With more activity outside our homes, we would now advise people to wear a cloth face covering in enclosed spaces where social distancing is not always possible, and you're more likely to come in contact with people you don't normally meet. The reason is face coverings can help to protect each other and reduce the spread of the disease, particularly if you have coronavirus-like symptoms. But this does not mean, I must stress this does not mean wearing medical face masks, 2R or FFP3, which must be reserved for people who need them. We have all lived so far with onerous restrictions, Mr. Speaker, on outdoor spaces and exercise. And this is where my right honourable friend interjects from the Secretary, because I know he's a keen swimmer, Mr. Speaker, and unfortunately we can't do anything for swimming pools, but we can do something for lakes and the sea. This is where we can go significantly further, and because there is a lower risk outdoors than indoors. So from Wednesday, there will be no limits on the frequency of outdoor exercise people can take. You can now walk, sit and rest in parks. You can play sports and exercise, and you can do all these things with members of your household, your own household, or with one other person from another household, provided you observe social distancing and remain 2 metres apart. And I do hope that's clear, Mr. Speaker, and I'm conscious people want to come back and ask questions in more detail, and I'll be very happy to answer. We shall increase the fines for the small minority who break the rules, starting at £100 but doubling with each infringement up to £3,600. You can drive as far as you like to reach an outdoor space subject to the same rules and the laws and guidance of the devolved administrations. I'm sorry to say, however, Mr. Speaker, that we shall continue to ask those who are clinically vulnerable, including pregnant women and people over 70, or those with pre-existing chronic conditions, to take particular care to minimise contact with those outside their households. And we must continue to shield people who are extremely vulnerable. They should, I'm afraid, remain at home and avoid any direct contact with others. I know that easing restrictions for the many will only increase the anguish of those who must remain shielded. So the government will look at every possible way of supporting the most vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, all of our precautions will count for little if our country is reinfected from overseas, so I give notice that we shall introduce new restrictions at the UK border, requiring 14 days of self-isolation for international arrivals, while respecting our common travel area with Ireland. Every day, we shall monitor our progress, and if we stay on the downward slope, and the R remains below 1. Then, and only then, will it become safe to go further and move to the second step. This will not happen until the 1st of June at the earliest, but we may then be in a position to start the phased reopening of shops, to return children to early years settings, including nurseries and childminders, to return primary schools to school in stages, giving priority to the youngest children in reception and year 1, and those in year 6 preparing for secondary school, and to enable secondary school pupils facing exams next year to get at least some time with their teachers. Our ambition, and I stress this is conditional, Mr. Speaker, is for all primary school pupils to return to the classroom for a month before the summer break. To those ends, we are publishing guidance on how schools might reopen safely. Step 2 could also include allowing cultural and sporting events behind closed doors for broadcasts, which I think would provide a much-needed boost to national morale. But nothing can substitute, Mr. Speaker, for human contact, and so the government has asked SAGE when and how we could safely allow people to expand their household group to include one other household on a strictly reciprocal basis. Finally, no earlier than July. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm conscious that you wanted me to wind up, and I may say...
I did say 10 minutes, and you've gone over it quickly.
I understand that. Well, perhaps, Mr. Speaker, would it be in order if I requested that my interrogation could continue for a little bit longer in order for me to make all these points? No earlier than July, we may be able to move to step 3 if and only if supported by the data and the best scientific advice. We would then aim to reopen some remaining businesses, including potentially hospitality, cinemas and hairdressers, as well as places of worship and leisure facilities. And this will depend on maintaining social distancing and new ways of providing services. So we will phase and pilot any reopenings to ensure public safety. And I must be clear again, if the data goes the wrong way, if the alert level begins to rise, we will have no hesitation in putting on the brakes, delaying or reintroducing measures locally, regionally or nationally. Mr. Speaker, our struggle against this virus has placed our country under the kind of strain that will be remembered for generations. But so too has the response of the British people. So too will the response of the British people, from dedicated shop workers keeping our supermarkets open and ingenious teachers finding new ways of inspiring their pupils, to the kindness of millions who have checked on their neighbours, delivered food for the elderly or raised astonishing amounts for charity. In these and in so many other ways, we are seeing the indomitable spirit of Britain. And Mr. Speaker, let me summarise by saying that people should stay alert by working from home if you possibly can, by limiting contact with others, by keeping your distance to 2 metres apart where possible, washing your hands regularly, and if you or anyone in your household has symptoms, you all need to self-isolate. Because if everyone stays alert and follows the rules, we can control the virus, keep the rate of infection down, and keep the number of infections down. And that is how we will be able, Mr. Speaker, to save lives and to save livelihoods as we begin to recover from the coronavirus. And I commend this statement to the House.
What I'd like to say is to the Leader of the Opposition, please take an extra minute after that. Thank you. Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance copy of his statement and for advance copy of the command paper that his office sent through an hour or so ago, and for taking time to speak to me and other opposition leaders yesterday before his speech. And can I start by acknowledging just how difficult the decisions are that now fall to be taken. We do recognise how difficult they are. What the country needs at this time is clarity and reassurance. And at the moment, both are in pretty short supply. And at the heart of the problem, it seems, is that the Prime Minister made a statement last night before the plan was written, or at least finalised. And that has caused considerable confusion. So yesterday afternoon, there was a number 10 press release that said, from Monday, i.e. today, anyone who can't work from home, for instance, those in construction and manufacturing, should be actively encouraged to go to work. So it's understood from that that it was today was the start day, and that was for construction and manufacturing. A few hours later, the Prime Minister made his statement. There was no express reference to time frame. Today, in the command document, page 25, it says that these policy changes apply from Wednesday, and the list has been expanded from construction and manufacturing to other sectors. So now we have a start date of Wednesday and a wider range of sectors that are going back to work on Wednesday. So far, so good. One of the key issues then is, will there be guidelines in place to ensure safety at the workforce? They were being consulted on last Sunday. They were vague and had big gaps in. So under protective equipment, it just said to be inserted or to be added. In the document I've now seen, it says that workplaces should follow the COVID secure guidelines, which I assume are the same guidelines, as soon as practicable. But under page 22, it says they will be released later this week. So we know some people are going back to work on Wednesday. The guidelines have not been published. They're apparently going to be released later this week. So can I just ask the Prime Minister, will the guidelines, the safety guidelines, be ready for Wednesday, which realistically means tomorrow, if workplaces are going to be ready for them for Wednesday morning? If not, is he seriously asking people to go back to work without the guidelines? Have the guidelines now been agreed with businesses and trade unions? That was the attempt that was going on Sunday week ago. And do the guidelines only apply in England? Can I then turn to getting to work, because this has been the other issue of some concern. The Prime Minister said last night that people shouldn't rely on public transport. The command paper now, page 26, says the government is working with transport providers to bring services back to pre-COVID-19 levels as soon as possible. So bring the services back to their old levels, and says social distancing guidelines on public transport must then be rigorously followed. So ramp up the service, new guidelines for social distancing. But again, we learned from page 26, unfortunately, those guidelines not ready. And they're coming later in the week. Well, are they coming tomorrow, ready for Wednesday, or later in the week? Because otherwise people will be using public transport, operators required to operate to guidelines that don't yet exist. And again, is that for England only? And have those guidelines been agreed with the transport providers and the relevant trade unions? Mr. Speaker, one other point about work. There is a real concern that the Prime Minister might be able to clarify for those that have got childcare responsibilities, with schools not going back till June, and I understand the conditionality behind that. Should they go back to work on Wednesday or not? Because they're in a quandary as to what to do. Can I then turn to international travel? Last night, the Prime Minister said in his speech that he was proposing to impose quarantine on people coming into the country by air. Well, given that 100,000 people have arrived in the UK since the start of lockdown, why is that only being introduced now? And is it only for those arriving by air? Because the command paper now says it's for all international arrivals. So does that mean all ports? And again, is that England or the UK? But it then goes on to say these international travel measures, i.e. the quarantine, will not come into force on Wednesday, unlike the other policy changes, but will be introduced as soon as possible. So when's that going to be? The Prime Minister also said we're going to be driven by the science, the data and public health. So what is the scientific evidence and the public health basis behind the measures announced and the stay alert message? And finally, the Prime Minister will know that there's not consensus either on messaging now or on policy between the UK government and those in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Not something I know he wanted to see, but now we're in that position. Raises serious concerns with a real danger of divergence. And again, this is clear from the document that he provided to me an hour or so ago. Page 27 says, travel to outdoor spaces is now permitted irrespective of distance, but we must respect the different rules in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Does that mean one can travel to the border but not presumably beyond the border where there are differences, which makes enforcement extremely difficult and clarity really difficult? So what can we do, what can he do to ensure that we exit lockdown as one united kingdom just as we entered it? Mr. Speaker, there are lots of questions, but so far precious few answers. The country does need clarity on this, and people need reassurance above all else. They need it in the next 48 hours. So can the Prime Minister now please provide that clarity?
Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful for all the questions that the right honourable gentleman has raised and the spirit in which he's raised them. And let's be absolutely clear, what we're trying to do now, and I think he was good enough to refer to himself, we're moving from a situation in which the people of this country have had the overwhelming impression that there's a very clear and simple piece of advice, Mr. Speaker, that we all have to obey, which is, broadly speaking, stay at home. And the people of this country have, by and large, followed that advice in perhaps more, emphatically more thoroughly than many other populations around the world. But thanks to their efforts, what's happened is that we've got the disease, we've made huge progress, Mr. Speaker, in fighting the disease, we've got the R down, and we need now to begin, as it were, to acknowledge the progress that has been made and to take the small, limited steps that we can with the R down where it is. And that's what the government is trying to do. And clearly, when you're coming out of a message that is so gloriously simple as stay at home, there will inevitably be complexities that he's rightly alluded to. Let me try and deal with some of the issues that he raised. What we're saying now is that you should stay at home if you can, but go to work if you must, if your job doesn't allow you to go to work. And plainly, he raised properly the issue of people who don't have the right childcare, Mr. Speaker, and we will count on employers to be reasonable. If people can't go to work because they can't get the childcare that they need, then plainly they are impeded from going to work, and they must be defended and protected on that basis. If their kids can't yet go to school because the schools aren't back, then plainly they can't go to work. And I think people with common sense, businesses, employers with common sense, do understand that. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to get that message across. But I think one thing that was perhaps missing from his analysis, Mr. Speaker, was the simple fact that over the last couple of months, actually plenty of businesses, from construction to manufacturing, office businesses of all kinds, actually have been proceeding, and they have been working, and they've been doing so in a way that respects social distancing, that is as COVID compliant as possible. And so, to answer his specific questions about the timescale for the publications of our guidelines, we will be publishing the guidelines on places of employment today, tonight. Transport will be out tomorrow, and we're being very, very consistent in what we've said throughout this period. At the very beginning, we said that you should stay at home if you can, go to work if you must. What's changed now is the emphasis and the encouragement that we're giving to people, as it were, to follow the initial guidance of March the 23rd, I think it was. He asks, Mr. Speaker, about what science it's going to be based on, and how we've reached the conclusions that we have. As I said last night, as I told the House, the reproduction rate of the disease is now between 0.5 and 0.9. It varies across the country, as he rightly says, and that's why actually different approaches by the devolved administrations are to be welcomed where those are appropriate to their specific needs. But overall, and I think that all leaders of the devolved administrations would confirm this, there is a very, very strong desire to move forward as 4 nations together. And perhaps I can sum up, and we all share the strong view that you should stay at home if you can. That remains the position. So the steps we're taking today are modest steps, entirely governed by the science. We hope that we may be in a position, and this is entirely conditional, to take further steps in. Forgive me, Mr. Speaker. Further steps in the next few weeks. he asks an entirely, given the complexity of what's being said, and he raises a perfectly reasonable point about people moving across the border into Wales for recreational purposes, or I totally and believe me, there will be myriad other hypothetical situations which people will be able to raise. But let's be absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker, that I think everybody understands what we are trying to do together. And that is working together as a country to obey the social distancing rules, which everybody understands. And I think what the British people understand, that this is the moment for the whole country to come together and to obey those rules and to apply their common sense in the application of those rules. And I have huge admiration for the way that the police have enforced them so far, and I know that the British public is going to continue to help the police and everybody to enforce those rules, to get our reproduction rate down, to get this disease even further under control by continuing to apply good, solid British common sense. It's worked throughout phase one, and I have no doubt that it's going to work in the second phase of the disease as well, of the fight against the disease as well.
Andrew Rossendale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I firstly thank the Prime Minister for the tremendous leadership of our nation during these times, and also for his comprehensive statement today. But would he please outline his post-Brexit and post-COVID economic plan to set our UK economy back on the right track in the coming decade? And does he agree with me that our priority must be to make plans now to boost domestic output in manufacturing and agriculture so that we can reduce our reliance on imports and support British business growth and job creation in constituencies like Romford, with a bold free enterprise agenda led, I believe, by a Prime Minister who I know will show the true bulldog spirit of this country and take our nation back to prosperity and greater things in the future.
Prime Minister, thank you.
Well, I thank my honourable friend very much, and I can assure him that the spirit of Romford will certainly be actuating our approach, and I can tell him that actually there's a huge difference between the way this government has handled this crisis and what happened in 2008. Huge difference. The most important, of course, is that we decided to look after the livelihoods and the job prospects of the families across the country. And we looked after people who are on low pay, on modest incomes in retail and hospitality with our coronavirus job protection scheme, with the furloughing scheme. And we are going to ensure that this economy comes back strongly, Mr. Speaker, and will be uniting and levelling up across the entirety of the country.
We now go to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is obvious that the last 24 hours has spread confusion. What the public desperately needs today is to be given some clarity. Mr. Speaker, lives are at risk, so political judgments and verdicts on this weekend's chaos will have to wait for another day. I respect the right of the Prime Minister to make his judgments on his scientific advice. I hope he is right in the determinations he is making, and that crucially, if evidence suggests an increase in the R rate, that he is prepared to act accordingly. Mr. Speaker, we need to be guided by one clear understanding, and that is that mixed messaging risks lives. In order to urgently re-establish clarity, I want to ask the Prime Minister 5 specific questions, and I would genuinely urge him to provide 5 clear answers. So for clarity, will the Prime Minister confirm that he accepts and respects that in the devolved nations the advice clearly remains: stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives, and that it is the legal right of all the First Ministers to set their approach for Scotland, for Wales and for Northern Ireland? Mr. Speaker, in terms of the new slogan, last night the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "I have consulted across the political spectrum across all 4 nations of the United Kingdom." Can the Prime Minister therefore explain why his government didn't share his new slogan with the devolved administrations, leaving them to learn of the change in the Sunday newspapers? Further to that, will the Prime Minister commit not to deploy this new slogan in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland unless the devolved governments decide otherwise? On quarantining following travel, when will these quarantine measures come into force? And can the Prime Minister confirm if his own Transport Secretary has told airline industry leaders that if there are too many obstacles in implementing it, it may not even happen? And finally, for ultimate clarity, will the Prime Minister reaffirm for the public and businesses in Scotland that the advice that they should follow will come directly from the Scottish Government and not the advice that he gave in last night's broadcast?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think just quickly, the answers are one, yes. Two, I think stay alert is a valid piece of advice, and indeed so is stay at home if you can. My answer, number four, is no. And Mr. Speaker, I would just say to the right honourable gentleman quite simply that I do think that the UK has been able, thanks to the cooperation I've had not just with honourable members opposite but across all four nations, I think we have been able to make a huge amount of progress together. I think most people actually understand where we are in fighting this disease. Most people looking at the reality, the practical reality of the advice that we are giving today can see that overall there is far, far more that unites the UK than divides it, though I know that it is always the political temptation to accentuate the divisions. That is not going to be the approach of this government, and I don't believe it should be the approach that commends itself to parties across this House.
Can I just urge members to speed up in the questions and certainly in the replies from the Prime Minister? I now go across to Kevin Hollinray. Kevin Hollinray.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement and his approach to start to reopen the economy while keeping the virus under control? Testing and tracing is key to the way forward. Would my right honourable friend agree that a way, if we can reduce the time taken to get test results back from the current 5 days to as little as 24 hours, would make that approach even more effective?
Absolutely, my honourable friend is completely right, and speed of turnaround is crucial in improving our testing. We have done 100,000 tests again yesterday, I'm pleased to say, but clearly pace of turnaround is absolutely critical for getting up to where we need to be, 200,000, as he knows, by the end of the month, and then a much more ambitious programme thereafter.
Go across to Sir Edward Davey. Sir Edward Davey.
Throughout this crisis, many of us have put party politics aside to support the national effort to defeat coronavirus. And we want to keep doing that, not least because the British people have sacrificed so much already. Yet in return, the government must be clear with the British people and reassure us that ministers are following the science and the advice of independent experts. So will he confirm new reports that neither the Chief Medical Officer nor the Chief Scientific Advisor signed off yesterday's shift in the public health message from stay at home to stay alert?
Mr. Speaker, that's not right.
We go across to Mike Wood. Mike Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many businesses restarting operations are unlikely to have order books full enough to sustain a full workforce for months after the end of formal restrictions. Will the Prime Minister look at how job support can be tapered rather than being withdrawn overnight, but more flexibility added, like being able to re-furlough for a week at a time to reflect a firm's workforce needs?
Mr. Speaker, I do think that the furloughing scheme has been one of the most remarkable features of the government's response, and it is unlike anything seen internationally. 6.5 million people currently are being supported. It is absolutely right that we should do it. I don't want to anticipate what my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, is going to say, but the House will hear more about that, Mr. Speaker, tomorrow.
We go across to Liv Saville-Roberts in Marion. Liv Saville-Roberts.
I understand the sense of optimism the Prime Minister wishes to convey, and I understand that people need hope. But we must not forget that over 31,000 people are dead. To the hundreds of thousands of grieving families, this doesn't feel like victory in a fight. Mr. Speaker, there is now a three nations approach. Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland all agree on policy and message. And I mean this with no malice, but for the sake of clarity, can he confirm that in almost everything he has announced today, the Prime Minister is acting as the Prime Minister of England?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, I reject that completely, and I think that most people looking at what we're saying will know that it carries, it is a very good advice for the entire population of the United Kingdom, though I perfectly respect the inflections and variations that may be necessary both locally, regionally and nationally to reflect differences in those areas. There is a higher R rate in some parts of the country, and as we come out of the disease, Mr. Speaker, we will be applying different measures in different places in order to get that R down locally, regionally and nationally as well.
Go across to Alicia Kearns. Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking everyone who has saved lives by following government guidance over the last 7 weeks? But constituents of Rutland and Melton have written to me about the few persistent offenders who continue to flout the rules. Will my right honourable friend confirm how great the increase in the fines will be, and that this will act as a greater deterrent and serve to make clear that the danger from the virus has not yet passed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that the starting point of the fines will be £100, will be lowered to £50 if paid within 14 days, but it will go up and up and up to, as I said earlier on, to £3,600. We don't want to impose these fines. Nobody wants to impose these fines. We don't want to add to the burdens of our wonderful police force. So that's why I hope and I know that the British people will exercise their common sense, Mr. Speaker.
Go across to Ian Paisley. Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for his statement. Can the Prime Minister ensure the House that the government will carefully manage the economy of the job retention scheme so as there is no cliff edge for the sectors that he has mentioned? He has already mentioned hospitality and tourism. In Northern Ireland, that's 16,000 people potentially face redundancy in another month's time. That has to be carefully managed. And will he protect Northern Ireland airports from unfair competition in the Republic of Ireland?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've made a substantial provision for the protection of airports and other large businesses with loans that the government has made available, and I can certainly assure him again. The question was asked earlier about the furloughing scheme. The House will hear more about that from the Chancellor, and I have no desire to steal his thunder on that, Mr. Speaker. But I can certainly tell the honourable gentleman what I think he would accept, that it has been one of the most salient, the most important features of this country's response so far to this crisis, that we have looked after the lowest paid, some of the lowest paid people in our society, the hardest working people, and we will continue to do so.
We go down to Henry Smith. Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent Centre for Cities report stated that the Crawley economy could be the worst affected anywhere in the United Kingdom because of the significance of the aviation industry. Can the Prime Minister say a little bit more about what support will be offered by the government for this crucial sector, not just to my local constituency, but also for the whole UK as a global island trading nation?
Minister. I thank my honourable friend, and he's raised this with me personally on several occasions. Aviation is crucial for our country and for our economy. The packages already available include Bank of England schemes for firms to raise capital, business interruption loan guarantee schemes, the time to pay flexibilities with tax bills. We will do everything we can to make sure that we keep Britain flying and get Britain flying again in the way that it needs to, and get airports flourishing in the way that they need to. But first, as I'm sure he will understand, Mr. Speaker, we must devote our energies as a nation to beating this virus.
Go up to Chiamora. Chiamora.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The North East has the highest coronavirus infection rate in the country and some of the highest levels of deprivation, where coronavirus mortality is twice that in the least deprived areas. Now the Prime Minister is telling those who cannot work from home, so mainly in lower paid, manual and people-facing jobs, to get back to work without transport, childcare, PPE or proper protections for workers in place, putting more risk on those already at risk. So will he say clearly that first and foremost, everyone has a duty and a right to stay safe? Yes or no?
Prime Minister.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. And I just remind of what I said to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, earlier on. Don't forget that many businesses have kept going throughout this crisis across many sectors. But we are going to insist that businesses across this country look after their workers, are COVID secure, COVID compliant. The Health and Safety Executive will be enforcing it, and we will be having spot inspections to make sure that businesses are keeping their employees safe. And it will of course be open to employees who do not feel safe to raise that, not just with their employers, but with the HSE, with the Health and Safety Executive as well, Mr. Speaker.
We go to Michael Fabricant. Michael Fabricant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know it'll take a while yet, but eventually the UK will be free of COVID-19. When that does happen, what is my right honourable friend's vision? Does he want to see a return to the old normal of pollution and crowded commuter trains, or does he see a better and cleaner future?
Okay, well, out of this tragedy and out of this disaster, of course, we hope that some changes and some opportunities will come. And I certainly see a huge opportunity for cleaner, greener transport. The UK will continue its mission to be a net zero nation by 2050. We know we can do it. And as the House will know, we've committed £2 billion, Mr. Speaker, to investing in cleaner transport, walking, cycling, amongst them.
We go over to Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister recognise that the COVID crisis has exposed grotesque levels of inequality within our society? And his statement yesterday has given a carte blanche to many employers to try and force people to come back to work without proper consideration of their health and safety, without consideration of the dangers that they're going to suffer in travelling to work. And does he not recognise that his statement, whilst the death rate is so high and the reinfection rate continues, will actually probably make the situation worse, not better? Will he reconsider very, very carefully and not lift the restrictions and not lift the lockdown until it's absolutely clear that we do have corona crisis under control, rather than affecting, as it is, the poorest and most vulnerable people in our society the worst? And his statement, I believe, will make the inequalities in this country even worse at the centre of this crisis.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must say I reject that characterisation of what we're doing. We are effectively restating the position of March the 23rd, but with a change of emphasis to make it clear that those who cannot work from home in sectors such as construction and manufacturing should go to work, provided that work is going to be COVID compliant, COVID secure. He's right to raise that vital issue of safety, provided the transport to get those workers there is COVID secure and COVID compliant. We're publishing papers today and tomorrow about how we propose to do that. It is a small step forward, but I believe it's the right step forward. The country has made huge exertions to bring the R down, Mr. Speaker, and made huge exertions to get this virus under control. It's right now that we should make some small steps forward.
We go over to South Yorkshire. Alexander Stafford. Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first thank the Prime Minister for his clear statement and for support and guidance he has given us all across Rother Valley. It is clear that this government is taking a balanced and pragmatic approach that ultimately will save lives. However, can the Prime Minister confirm that this plan is both dynamic and flexible enough to ensure that we can reopen up different businesses at different times and in different locations, so that we can kickstart our economy as soon as we are able to, as only with a strong economy can we have a strong NHS?
My honourable friend is entirely right to, and I congratulate him, by the way, on the birth of his daughter Persephone, perhaps appropriate for a country that is beginning to take steps out from the darkness, Mr. Speaker. We will, as we do that, as we take these steps, we will of course be flexible. As I said in my answer just now to the right honourable gentleman from Islington, we will make sure that where there are local flare-ups, where we see the disease taking off again, we will not hesitate to put on the brakes. But he's absolutely right that to have a strong NHS, as we must and we do and we will, we need a strong economy as well.
We're going up to Scotland to Drew Hendry. Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Reports in the press say that his government are preparing to cut the rate of support in the furlough scheme by a quarter. Can you assure us that this is not the case and that his advice for people to return to work is not an excuse to reduce spending over public health?
Minister, I have a considerable respect for the press, but I would advise him not to necessarily to believe everything that he reads about that matter until he's heard from the Chancellor, who, as I say, will be speaking to the House tomorrow about it.
Going down to Warrington South, Andy Carter. Andy Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement and recognise the maximum caution he is taking in gradually lifting these restrictions? I've heard today from many constituents here in Warrington who are parents of school-aged children. They're keen to return to work this week in a safe way, but will need some help with looking after their families while schools remain closed. Can the Prime Minister outline what guidance government are giving to parents to help them with childcare?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he raises a very, very important point, which I've addressed earlier a couple of times, and I want to stress again, for the benefit of the House, that and for the country, we want to, if we can, we want to bring primary schools back at the beginning of next month, reception year 1 and year 6, and then to have all primary school children getting at least a month of education before the holidays in July. I appreciate that as that's going to be a process in which not everybody will be able to get their kids into school as fast perhaps as they would in order to get, but they would like in order to get back to work. There will be childcare needs. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Education, will be setting out in further detail how we propose to help those with particular childcare needs. But I want to stress that if you can't get the childcare you need to get to work, then that is plainly an impediment on your ability to work, and your employer should recognise that.
We go to Catherine McKinnell. Catherine McKinnell.
Thank you. Prime Minister, hundreds are dying every day and we still don't have sufficient testing and tracing to measure and control the spread of infection, yet the government's starting to relax lockdown in a haphazard and confusing manner. He continues to claim his strategy is a success, despite us having the highest death toll in Europe. So is it the government's position that as long as the NHS can cope, it's less important how many catch this virus and sadly die?
Mr. Speaker, I must reject what she said about relaxing lockdown. We're not ending the lockdown. We have to be very, very clear with people that the measures remain in place. What we're saying is that they should look at the precise guidance that was given, and that is that if they must go to work, if their job means that they must go to work, then they should be actively encouraged to go to work, and we're setting out steps to allow them to do so. And the other important change that we're making this week relates to people's ability to exercise. As we go forward, we will be governed in the next 2 steps, whether on June the 1st or the beginning of July, will be governed entirely by the science. And indeed, we will continue to work with opposition parties and across all 4 nations as we go forward, Mr. Speaker.
Go across to Martin Vickers. Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I fully support the cautious approach outlined by my right honourable friend. He will be aware that many small businesses in Cleethorpes and other seaside resorts face considerable problems, such as guest houses, bars and restaurants, and they are going to need continuing support. What assurance can he give that that will be forthcoming?
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as somebody who's enjoyed the wonderful hospitality sector in his constituency on a couple of occasions at least, I know how important it is and how vibrant it is. And I would just remind him of what has been achieved so far to support the hospitality sector with the coronavirus job retention scheme, the furloughing scheme. I think it has been very, very important. The bounce back loans so far, I think, have paid out. Loaned £5 billion already, and I don't want to anticipate what, as I say, my right honourable friend the Chancellor will say about the furloughing scheme, but the House should expect, as I've said several times, more very shortly.
19 withdrawn, so we go to Mary Robinson in Cheadle. Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Greater Manchester, whilst the curve is flattening, it is not clearly on a downward path, with an R rate which could be as high as 0.9. In view of this, what message would my right honourable friend give to my constituents in terms of their alertness on the 5-tier scale? And does he agree that for city regions such as Greater Manchester, a significant increase in testing and contact tracing is vital in controlling this virus as we begin to ease the restrictions?
My honourable friend is entirely right, and that's why we're recruiting 18,000 trackers, tracers by the 18th of this month, and they will conduct a huge operation, Mr. Speaker, to trace anybody who's been in contact with somebody who tests positive for the virus, which is, of course, why it's so vital, as she rightly says, to have a massive testing operation that is being hugely scaled up. As I've told the House today, yesterday we achieved 100,000 tests. We're going to go up to 200,000 by the end of the month, and testing, tracking and tracing will be absolutely integral to our ability finally to defeat this virus.
Go across to Karen Burke. Karen Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If there is to be a return to employment, it is absolutely dependent upon safe public transport. As I understand the roadmap, face coverings are to be advisory and the wearing of them will not be enforced. Can I ask the Prime Minister for a one-word answer? Should, indeed must, everybody travelling on London buses and tubes wear face covering? Yes or no?
Prime Minister.
I think she said should or indeed must, and there are two. We're certainly not compelling people to wear face coverings, but plainly they can be of benefit to others, primarily because they stop the aerosol transmission of droplets which may contain infection. So we can help each other, as I said in my introductory remarks, Mr. Speaker, if we do wear cloth face coverings in confined spaces such as transport, where you're going to come across people that you're not normally in contact with, or in shops. We think that it is advisable to wear such cloth face coverings.
Go across to Dr. Luke Evans. Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Page 30, under step 2, it says opening non-essential retail won't happen before the 1st of June. So what will my right honourable friend do to make sure the banks expedite the applications for both the bounce back loan and the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, which provide vital cash to ensure that both small and medium-sized businesses can survive through?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I perhaps anticipated it by pointing out that the bounce back scheme of loans of 50,000 has already paid out 5 billion, and I'm given to understand that actually some businesses that have applied for the bounce back loan have got the cash in their accounts on the same day.
Go to Glasgow to Chris Stevens. Chris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hope the Prime Minister will join me in thanking the civil service, particularly employees in HMRC and DWP who are processing payments. They deserve a reward. So will the Prime Minister follow the lead of the Scottish Government and have an interim above inflation pay settlement and place a moratorium on job cuts and office closures?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to make any commitments now from the dispatch box on future pay settlements, but what I can say is that I am lost in admiration of the efforts of our civil servants, whether in DWP, HMRC, even in the Treasury. If you think about the furloughing scheme, everybody said it was impossible. Everybody said it was far too complicated. You'd never get that cash into people's pockets. But, Mr. Speaker, they did it within 4 weeks. I think it's a fantastic tribute to the work of our civil service, and I thank them from the bottom of my heart.
Go across to Robert Courts. Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for his update on progress of testing and tracing this invisible killer. But can he confirm for the people of West Oxfordshire that the new systems that we are putting in place will, in the fullness of time, be able to detect local flare-ups?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and the intention is that the COVID alert system in time will be sufficiently sensitive and flexible as to detect local flare-ups, so that, for instance, if the COVID is detected in the water supply of a certain town or whatever, then steps can be taken, or in a school in an area, then steps can be taken on the spot to deal with that flare-up. Measures can be taken to keep the R down locally as well as nationally.
Go to Ruth Jones. Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister claims to have devised a new stage of his plan, having consulted across all 4 nations of the UK. Yet the First Minister of Scotland claims the first she saw of it was in the newspapers. The First Minister of Wales says the UK government only engages in fits and starts, whilst the First Minister of Northern Ireland is sticking to the original stay-home message. Devolution does exist, and we have it here across the UK. So can the Prime Minister please explain what on earth is going on?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think any impartial view of what the UK is doing will see there is much more that unites our approach than divides it. Though, as I say, I note that, of course, it might seem attractive sometimes to accentuate the divisions. We fully respect and understand the necessity where there are different rates of infection, the necessity sometimes to take a different approach. But I can also say to the Honourable Lady that there has been intensive communication and very good communication between this government and all the devolved administrations throughout this period, and that will continue.
26 is withdrawn, so we go across to Kate Green. Kate Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one should be expected to take up or return to a job that isn't safe. So can the Prime Minister confirm that there is no intention of changing the relaxation of rules on benefits conditionality? Doing so could pressure people to attend unsafe and risky workplaces.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, nobody should be penalised for doing the right thing and helping this whole country to defeat this virus.
We now go across to Robert Halfon. Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Close to 90% of vulnerable children are not in education. Will my right honourable friend support a catch-up premium alongside a national education volunteer force of graduate charities and retired teachers to provide tuition and pastoral care to these left-behind pupils?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for what he does to campaign for vulnerable children and for education generally. We're looking at an Education Endowment Foundation, working with the Education Endowment Foundation and other partners to see what we can do to support the most disadvantaged vulnerable children. He will know that, of course, under the existing measures, Mr. Speaker, vulnerable children can now go to schools. I want to thank all the teachers who are currently teaching them, as they're teaching at least some of the children of key workers.
Go across to James Murray. James Murray.
Mr. Speaker, Perivale, Greenford and Northolt tube stations in my constituency have twice the London average of construction workers living nearby. Although their employers may have been asked to consider staggering start and finish times to reduce pressure on public transport, the Business Minister confirmed to me this is not mandated by government guidance. To keep my constituents and others safe, will the Prime Minister now instruct site managers to stagger their operating times and have the government take responsibility for making sure this happens?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we will, of course, be issuing our guidance on COVID-secure workplaces, as I've said several times already. We're also working with Transport for London, a body that he and I know well, to ensure that people on TfL are kept safe, that we have social distancing on the tube. And, of course, people will instinctively say that's going to be very, very difficult. Yes, it is going to be very difficult. It will mean very substantial reductions in capacity, Mr. Speaker, but we must do it to make it work, to make sure that the Honourable Gentleman's constituents can get safely to work.
Go across to Faye Jones. Faye Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful that the Prime Minister is working closely with the Welsh Government to design a four-nations approach to ending the coronavirus lockdown. This is so important for my constituents in Brecon and Radnorshire who share a border with England. But would he agree with me that while the R number continues to vary across the country, restrictions in Wales remain the same, and the changes he announced last night are not a green light for tourism or for people to travel to their second homes in Wales?
Minister.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful. This is why it's so important that we should try and get as much clarity as possible. And I hope that the House does understand that when you're making changes of this complexity, the messaging is crucial, but it is also difficult. And she's completely right. We don't want to see people. Let me repeat: we don't want to see people travelling to another home for a holiday or to a second home. That is not what this is about. This is about allowing people the pleasure and the exercise of going to places, to parks, to places, to national parks, places of outstanding beauty, and taking advantage of the open air.
Lawrence Robertson, going across to Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a few days ago, my father, Jim, died of coronavirus in hospital, but he didn't catch the virus in the community. He caught it in the hospital when he went in for another illness. As the Prime Minister quite rightly tries to reduce the spreading of the virus in communities and care homes, but we will also do whatever we can do to try to stop the spreading of the virus in hospitals.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm so sorry to hear about my honourable friend's father, and I'm sure the whole House joins with me in extending him our sincerest condolences. And the point that he makes about care homes is also, I'm afraid, a very, very important one. And it will be no consolation to those who have lost friends and relatives in care homes during the current epidemic, but the numbers are very substantially coming down now. The numbers of deaths in care homes are very substantially coming down. But where he is totally right is that we cannot make progress as a nation on the steps that we've outlined, the further steps that we've outlined, step 2, step 3, unless we crack these twin epidemics, both in care homes and in the NHS. And I've been very clear with that both last night and today in the House, and I hope that the House understands that.
We go across to Daisy Cooper. Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has set out 5 tests that underpin the alert system, but there is one big problem. Whilst the government has told us how many pieces of PPE they've procured, how many tests they've undertaken, and how many temporary hospital beds they've created, to date, it hasn't once told members or the public how those numbers compare to what we actually need. So will the Prime Minister report to the House openly and regularly on both sets of data, what we have and what we need, and also set out how those metrics will inform his decision?
Prime Minister.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for getting me on my feet faster. The Honourable Lady raises a very, very important point. I will try to give the House more details of what we are doing, but I can tell her that so far, in spite of all the difficulties that I know people have experienced with PPE, it is the case that we've had no national stockouts on or absolute shortages of any item of PPE, and we're continuing to turn the situation round and to get billions of items to where they need to go.
We go across to Sir Edward Lee. Sir Edward Lee.
The phased approach of the government to protect public safety is obviously correct, but we are now faced with perhaps the biggest recession in hundreds of years and an unparalleled increase in the public sector. So will the Prime Minister ensure that, whereas in the past these increases have often been accompanied by waste and fraud and incompetence at the expense of the taxpayer, he will put the most effective public accounts controls in to protect the taxpayer and to pay for all this? He will ensure that we get Britain back to work, and where it's possible to have social distancing, people are actually encouraged to work.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and of course we will have effective accounting of the investments that we're making to protect the public, and of the furloughing scheme and all the many other expenditures we are obliged to make. But I think he would also understand that the biggest single economic risk we face at the moment is the risk that the virus should surge back again and trigger a second spike. And that's why we all need to work together, as I'm sure everybody understands, to continue to depress the R, keep the virus under control and stay alert.
Go across to Maria Edel. Maria Edel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government originally said the government would fund councils for whatever they needed to get communities through the COVID crisis, but now says it will only fund the things government have specifically asked them to do. Now, Liverpool City Council and Knowsley Borough Council have both received less than half of what they've spent so far, despite having one of the worst outbreaks in the country and already having lost 2/3 of their government funding in the last 10 years. So will the Prime Minister now undertake to reimburse them the full costs of COVID, as promised at the start of this outbreak?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, as the Right Honourable Lady knows, we have invested the 3.2 billion extra into supporting local councils. I will take away what she said about Liverpool City Council and Knowsley Council, and I will take it up with my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary for Communities and Local Government.
36 withdrawn. We go across to Chris Law. Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government said yesterday that stay alert will mean stay alert by staying home as much as possible. However, this morning, the Prime Minister's Deputy, the Foreign Secretary, has said that people can travel as far as they want for exercise and can meet with other people in public places if they use some common sense. So can the Prime Minister tell me what stay alert actually means? And where is the common sense and no longer keeping our families and communities safe by staying at home, protecting the NHS and saving lives?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think it'd be perfectly obvious to the House what we're trying to do and what we're saying by stay alert. What we're now saying is we're re-emphasising or emphasising the importance of those who cannot work from home going to work, provided their workplaces are COVID secure, provided that they observe the rules of social distancing on public transport or however they go to work. That is what staying alert means. It's going to be absolutely vital. Staying alert is going to be absolutely vital to our continued success in beating this virus. I think the British public understands exactly what we're trying to do, Mr. Speaker, and I know that they can rise again to this challenge.
Go across to Jane Hunt. Jane Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Loughborough University is responsible for producing some of our very best athletes and engineers. Unfortunately, their training and studies have been disrupted. The university is campus-based with all facilities on site. They would now like to bring back some student athletes to train and their engineers to attend concentrated lab work sessions, all while maintaining social distancing on campus and isolation from the wider community. Will the Prime Minister therefore work with universities to help them provide students with access to vital facilities to enable them to safely continue with their studies and training?
Prime Minister.
The short answer is yes, Mr. Speaker. I know Loughborough University well. It's an outstanding university, and I thank her for championing it, and we will work with Loughborough and across the sector to see what we can do in the way that she describes, whilst maintaining social distancing, and we can do it.
We'll cross to Bill Esterson. Bill Esterson.
People are worried about going back to work, about their safety and about infecting their loved ones. They don't understand why guidelines weren't published before they were told to go back to work. The Prime Minister's ambiguity and lack of clarity has just made matters worse. So will he take on board the concerns voiced by unions, workers and employers? Will he tell us how he will enforce those guidelines to keep people safe? And will he say how workers will be able to voice their concerns about their safety at work.
Mr. Speaker, this country has made huge progress in the last 2 months. Thanks to our collective efforts, we've got the R down below 1. Now is the time to make small, calibrated changes, respectful always of the science and of the risk of a second spike. And that's why we're emphasising that if you must go to work, if you can't work from home, then you should do, provided. Now, he's right to draw attention to this, provided your workplace is COVID secure, and we're publishing further guidance on that, and provided you observe the rules on social distancing. It's common sense. I do think the British people understand what we're trying to do, and I think they also understand that this is the right time, Mr. Speaker, to begin those modest steps.
Now comes the final question from Peter Aldous. Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is right to highlight above all else the need to avoid a second spike. And a concern that I am receiving, both from individual constituents and from businesses, is that the reopening of primary schools could present a significant threat, both in the classroom and at the school gate. Can the Prime Minister assure the House that he and his government will do all that they can to address these worries before allowing primary schools to reopen?
Mr. Speaker, and I should stress that we've only made the announcement on primary schools, as we say everything, because we have the guidance from our scientists and our medical officers, and we think that we could get to that stage on June the 1st. But I want to stress to him that it is all, as I said to the House, it's all conditional, it's all provisional. We must continue to drive down the R. We must continue our fight against the coronavirus, and we will be publishing guidance, Mr. Speaker, about safety in schools, about how parents, teachers and children can use schools, can go to schools with confidence, Mr. Speaker. There will be change, the environment will be different in our school settings, but that doesn't mean that they should be closed down forever. We will be gradually, if we can make progress, we will be gradually restarting, as I say, in June.
Order. I suspend the House for 30 minutes till 11 minutes past 5. Order.